Hi, Mary. Sorry about that. So we're talking about alveolar ventilation versus dead space ventilation. And when we push a volume of air into the lungs, some of that air will fill up the conducting airways, and some of that air goes into the alveoli. And we have to have a large enough tidal volume so that once the conducting airways are full, there's enough volume to go to the alveoli. So imagine if the tidal volume that goes into the lungs is really small. All it would do is fill the conducting airways, and there would not be enough to get to the alveoli. So that's why it's always important to monitor your patient's tidal volumes and make sure that the tidal volumes are large enough to give effective ventilation to the alveoli. All right, so now what does it say on the PowerPoint? The first type of dead space is called anatomic dead space, and this refers to all of the conducting airways. And it's called dead space because there's no contact with the blood. So the conducting airways are considered dead space. The amount of air that fills the conducting airways is equal to 1 ml for every pound of a person's ideal body weight. And then it gives you an example to explain that. So if a person has an ideal body weight of 150 pounds, they will have an anatomic dead space of 150 mLs. So what if the person's ideal body weight is 100 pounds? How much volume is in their conducting airways? 100 mLs. So every 1 pound of ideal body weight, 1 ml of anatomic dead space. So next it says, if the tidal volume is 500 ml and the anatomic dead space volume is 150 ml, how much volume goes to the alveoli? And what you do to find the answer is you subtract the two numbers. So you're given the tidal volume, you subtract the amount of air that stays in the conducting airways, the dead space, and what's left is the volume of air that goes down to the alveoli. So here, 500 ml went into the lungs, 150 mLs of that air stays in the conducting airways, and then the 350 mLs actually goes to the alveoli. All right, so comparing, maybe I have it here. Yeah, it's at the bottom. Another example, a 5-foot person has an ideal body weight of 100 pounds. What is the anatomic dead space volume for this person? 100 mLs. Yeah, 100 pounds ideal body weight, 100 mLs in the conducting airways. So how much volume goes to the alveoli if the tidal volume is 300 mLs? 200 mLs. Very good. So you take the tidal volume, subtract what stays in the conducting airways, and the rest of it goes to the alveoli. So you have 200 mLs going to the alveoli. Then the last question, what is the ratio of dead space volume to the tidal volume? So to get the ratio, you divide. You've got the anatomic dead space on top, the tidal volume on the bottom. So 100 over 300 is what you do. The anatomic dead space on top, the tidal volume on the bottom. 100 over 300. So the ratio of dead space to tidal volume, you put the dead space on top and the tidal volume on the bottom. When you divide, you're going to come up with a decimal point. So we were talking about 33%. Actually, it comes out to 0.33. So it's asking you for the ratio, so you could leave it in decimal form. And then to convert it to percentage, just multiply by 100. Just to give you any more examples.
Just the percentage or the amount?
Percent. Yes. So if you leave it in the decimal form, you don't have any units. You would just put the ratio as 0.33. And if you convert it to percentage, then you would say 33%. Yeah, so no units with 0.33. It's just the ratio.
I thought it was a ratio that it was had a colon 1 to 3.
Yeah, that's true too. Like to do 1 to 0.33. Yes, that's correct. Put a 1 in front of it, a colon, and then 0.33.
Do we care how we answer it?
No,
Oh,
either one. All right, so when you divide the anatomic dead space by the tidal volume, if it comes out to 30% or less, that's normal. So 30% is normal.
so that would technically be abnormal.
Yeah. So normal ratio is 30%. If it's 50% or higher, it's considered abnormal. So ratio of 50% or 0.5 or higher is considered abnormal. So what if it's 0.4? Yeah, it's elevated, but we're not concerned. Once it's 50% or higher, that's a message to you that you're not delivering a big enough tidal volume to your patient.
Is there a critical number on the low side or is anything below 30?
Anything below 30. Critical? No.
Like how, like, okay, so if 30 is normal, but we're not concerned till it's 50. So on the opposite way, like 30 is normal. If it's 25, are we concerned or?
No, it just means that the patient's taking in a really deep breath. Yeah, that's okay. All right, and then there's also alveolar dead space, and this is alveoli that do not take part in gas exchange. We talked about this with VQ mismatching, where the alveoli might have some pneumonia, it infiltrates, so there's no gas exchange occurring in those alveoli. So that's alveolar dead space. And then when you combine the two, the anatomic dead space plus alveolar dead space, that's called physiologic dead space. So it says, for now, the physiologic dead space is a value that will be given to you. So towards the end of the semester, there's another formula that we can plug into to figure out what the patient's physiologic dead space is. But I don't want to overwhelm you at the beginning of the semester. So I just let you know what physiologic dead space is. It's a combination of two types of dead space. The conducting airways and then alveoli that are not taking part in gas exchange. That's physiologic dead space. And the amount, the volume of physiologic dead space for now will be given to you. It's not something you have to figure out. So once you're given the physiologic dead space and the tidal volume, and you're asked to calculate the dead space to tidal volume ratio, you do the same thing again. Dead space on top, tidal volume on bottom. Here's a critical thinking question. Does shallow breathing, like if you're breathing smaller than normal tidal volume, does that compromise good gas exchange?
Yes.
Very good. Can you explain to me how or why? But how?
You're not,
Go ahead.
because you're not getting like enough lung volume, like volume of air into the alveolar.
Very good. You're not getting enough volume of air into the alveoli where the gas exchange takes place. Okay.
Would that increase the ratio of dead space tidal volume?
Yes. Yeah, very good. So small tidal volume, it's going to have that higher percentage of the ratio of dead space to tidal volume. Very good. Good application. Chris, you had a question?
I was just gonna say, it would increase the ratio.
Oh, okay. Yes, very good. So less alveolar ventilation, you're going to have a higher dead space to tidal volume ratio. Bottom line is the tidal volume is too small for your patient. Another critical thinking question. Patient A breathes through their nose and conducting airways. Patient B breathes through a tracheostomy tube. The patients have identical tidal volumes and are of similar height and weight. Comparing these two patients, more tidal volume is distributed to the alveoli in patient A. Patient B, it's the same in both patients, or D, not enough information is given. Go ahead, Chris.
B,
Patient B,
because they don't have as much anatomic dead space.
very good. So a tracheostomy tube goes directly into the trachea. So you don't have all of the oral pharynx that is part of the conducting airways and takes up space. So when you're delivering tidal volume directly through the tracheostomy tube, there's less dead space. So if you have less dead space, you're going to have more air going to the alveoli. All right, so that was it, comparing dead space ventilation to tidal volume. Now we're going to talk about minute volume. So minute volume is abbreviated with a capital V and then a subscript of letter E. Sometimes it's lowercase, sometimes it's uppercase, but it's the letter E. Where does E come from? I have no idea. No idea. But that's how it's abbreviated. Minute volume is the total volume of air entering and leaving the lungs over 1 minute. It is the product of the tidal volume and the respiratory rate. So if you have a volume of air going in and out of the lungs, that's the tidal volume. And if the example here is 500 cc's, the normal respiratory rate is 12 breaths per minute. So if you multiply 500 cc's times 12 breaths, you're going to come up with a minute volume. And cc's, mLs. So here it says cc's, down here it says ml, so same thing. But 500 times 12 is 6,000 mLs. And then how do you convert that into liters? Divide by 1,000 or move your decimal point 3 places to the left. So in D2L, there's lots of practice questions on this calculation. So here's some sample questions. If the respiratory rate is 24 breaths per minute and the tidal volume is 400 mLs each breath, what is the minute volume? Do you have your phone or do you need a calculator?
9.6.
9.6 liters? Very good. Did everybody get that?
Yeah.
Okay, how do you convert from mLs to liters? We already talked about that. If the minute volume is measured on the ventilator and the respiratory rate is known, how is the tidal volume calculated? Do you know how to do this math? Very good. We said the formula is respiratory rate times tidal volume. Gives us our minute volume. But if we know what was it, the respiratory rate, we know the minute volume, how do we find the tidal volume? So we want to get tidal volume all by itself. So to get tidal volume by itself, you've got to divide both sides by the respiratory rate. This cancels and becomes 1. So you have tidal volume is minute volume divided by respiratory rate. So it would be minute volume so minute volume divided by respiratory rate is tidal volume. Okay, another critical thinking question at the bottom. If the tidal volume is smaller than normal, how does the body maintain the same minute ventilation?
Increase.
Very good. Respiratory rate will increase to keep the same minute ventilation. So the body does this naturally. It knows if it needs a faster respiratory rate. So you'll see patients in the hospital that are tachypneic and they're breathing fast. And maybe they need to breathe fast to maintain their minute ventilation because they're maybe they have a fibrotic lung disease and their tidal volumes are small, or they had some pulmonary edema or ARDS going on. So they will breathe fast with smaller tidal volumes. So to go to that patient and say, slow down your breathing, it's not physiologically normal for them at that time to be breathing 12 to 16 times a minute. So telling somebody to breathe slower doesn't help them, bottom line. Maybe they need to breathe smaller tidal volumes because of the pathology going on in their lungs. So those smaller tidal volumes, they will need a faster respiratory rate. How does a ventilator calculate minute ventilation? Do you think it waits a full minute to measure the volume over the past minute? Or do you think it looks at a 10-second window of time and extrapolates what the minute volume would be over the full minute? Yeah, choice B. A ventilator can't wait a whole minute to say, hey, your patient is disconnected from the ventilator, there's no minute volume. That wouldn't be safe. So what it does is every 10 seconds, it updates the information and reports the minute ventilation. So you're constantly getting this updated information on the minute volume. So if a patient stops breathing, within 10 seconds, you'll see the minute volume says 0. It's not going to be a whole minute later, the minute volume says 0. Within 10 seconds, it'll say minute volume is 0. So it's continuously updating the data. Okay, and then on the ventilator, graphics are a big deal. So we're going to spend a lot of time looking at graphics and what are you supposed to take away from looking at the graphics. So here it just starts off by explaining what we're going to measure. We're going to measure pressure. Pressure is measured in centimeters of water. Positive pressure is created by the ventilator during inspiration and at the end of exhalation. So during inspiration, when we're pushing the air into the lungs, pressure builds up. And then at the end of exhalation, we usually keep a positive pressure in the lungs. It never goes down to atmospheric pressure or 0. There's always going to be a little bit of positive pressure kept in the lungs. The next thing we measure is volume. Volume is measured in mLs or liters. It's the amount of air that enters the patient's lungs during inspiration. So the amount of air that enters the patient's lungs during inspiration. So I've been talking about tidal volume last week, this week. I think you're getting the gist of that. The amount of air that goes into the lungs and comes back out, that's tidal volume. So we're measuring that, and then we measure minute volume all the time. So we're measuring not only the air that goes in and out each breath, but we also measure what's going in and out over a minute. The next one is flow rate. This is how fast the gas flows into the patient's lungs during inspiration. It says if 1 liter of air enters the lungs in 1 second, we say the flow rate is 1 liter per second. So that's where the units come from for flow. It's the amount of volume over time. That's flow rate. And then on the ventilator, the flow rate, it shows up in liters per minute. So if the flow is 1 liter per second, you don't see that. What you see is liters per minute. That's what's reported. Question? Let's see. So to give an analogy, how fast are you running when you run from here to the corner? Are you running like 100 feet per second? That's how fast you're running. And then you would compare minute volume to how far did you run over a minute. Let's say you kept running for a whole minute. How far did you go? So one is how fast and the other one's how far. So for flow rate, it's how fast we're pushing the air into the lungs. So if you could take 1 second to push the air in, you could take 2 seconds to push the air in. So that would be flow rate. And then how much volume over a minute? That would be minute volume. You're welcome. All right, so looking at the graphics. When you look at a graphic, always look on the left to see what's being measured. And up here, it tells us flow is being measured in liters per minute. And so on the graphic, when you're looking at flow rate, everything above the baseline, here the baseline is 0. Everything above that is the air going into the lungs. Everything below the baseline is the air coming back out of the lungs. So this is inspiration up here. This is exhalation down here. So here when we're looking at the flow rate, got like a little squiggle there, just from the patient breathing differently, I guess. But the flow starts off low and then it goes a little bit faster. And then at this point, there's like a straight line. So at this point, the person stops breathing in and they start exhaling. So that's one point in time for this straight line. Now the air comes back out of the lungs. And when it hits 0, there's no more air coming back out of the lungs. And that's why it's at baseline. So the air flows in, the air flows out, no more air flowing out. And then the next breath begins. Question?
Yes, ma'am. The first level where it reaches to about 25, and there's like an indentation, and then it goes up. What happened there?
So they were breathing in and maybe hiccuped or something.
Okay.
Like the flow stops and then it continues. So maybe just like a little pause in their breath. The pressure during inspiration, pressure goes negative. So that tells us this is not a ventilator breath. This is a spontaneous breath. Because normally when we breathe spontaneously, we generate a negative pressure in our lungs. So when we look at this and we see this going below the baseline, that's a negative pressure. That's a spontaneous breath. So the air is flowing in during this spontaneous breath. And the last one shows the volume that went into the lungs, going all the way up. And then the volume that came back out of the lungs all the way down. So if the person completely exhales, it'll touch the baseline. So air goes in, air comes back out. All right, now here's what it looks like when the patient is on the ventilator. I'm going to start with the middle graph because that's what looks a little different. So the middle graph, it says pressure. So we're monitoring pressure. And the ventilators that we use are positive pressure ventilators. So it's pushing air into the lungs. So pressure builds up during inspiration. So first, there's a little negative dip here. And that's because the patient initiated the breath. Their diaphragm contracts, the rib cage goes out. They created a little negative pressure. And that's that little dip that we see right before the positive pressure breath. So how much pressure built up during inspiration? Can you tell approximately what the peak pressure is from looking at this graph? 24, and what are the units? Centimeters water, very good. All right, so pressure builds up as the breath of air goes in, and then it's time for the patient to exhale, and then the pressure comes back down to baseline. And why isn't baseline at 0?
They let out the air.
Positive pressure and expiratory pressure.
Very good. So we're keeping a positive pressure in the lungs at all times and expiratory pressure.
Is this what they talk about when they say you can identify what mode you're in by looking at the waveform? Because the second breath there, there's no patient trigger, so this would be AC mode.
Yeah, very good.
Because you're still gonna get the breath, whether it's patient trigger or not.
Right. Question?
I have a question, but I was actually on the previous slide on the pressure for spontaneous breathing, when you said you could tell because it goes a little bit negative.
Uh-huh.
But on that graph, like what's showing that it's negative? Because like the flow has negatives in it, but the pressure doesn't show like negatives, if that makes sense.
Okay. So when the air comes back out, it's this little positive blip for a spontaneous breath. So air going in is the negative part. The positive part is the air coming back out of the lungs.
And it's just not going to have obviously as strong of a positive graph and mark as a ventilator.
Right. Yeah. So this is spontaneous breathing. Gretchen, go ahead.
On the top one for flow, so when it's going up is during inspiration, and then it goes down, and then when it starts to go up again, it's when they're exhaling. So what about when the drop, what's happening then?
The drop is when it's switching from inspiration to exhalation. Yes.
There's the exhalation on the flow there, then you start at the very bottom part.
Correct. So I was telling you how everything below this baseline is exhalation.
Doesn't the exhalation start right after peak pressure? Like at the top of the waveform?
Let's look at the next one where it's a ventilator breath. So here we have the air flowing into the lungs. And at this point is when inspiration stops. No more flow is going into the lungs. Now the exhalation valve on the ventilator opens. And now the air can start coming back out of the lungs. So what part ends inspiration? Like right here. This is all one point on the time graphic. So not only is inspiration ending, but exhalation is beginning. Did that answer your question or no?
That's on the ventilator. The other
Yeah,
one-
this one is on the ventilator.
The other one has a little bit of slope. Look at this, a spontaneous breath and the one before. Little, it's negligible, but there's a little bit of a slope there. So
This,
the expiration would start right about there, right?
yes.
Until you completely into the lungs at the bottom.
Yeah, this is the air coming back out of the lungs.
So if we had to label it on a test, exhalation only starts at the very bottom of that triangle.
Yes. Yeah, so everything below baseline is considered exhalation. And again, this straight line is all one point in time. Another question, Thomas?
No, I'm still a little confused with that.
Tell me what you're confused about.
You're saying that exhalation starts at the very corner, bottom corner, but then you're saying exhalation starts at the slope at the top.
It's all the same point on the time.
So that exhalation doesn't start at that bottom corner, it starts at the top slope, right?
Let's use this one. So at this point is when the exhalation valve opens, and instead of the air going into the lungs, now the air is coming back out of the lungs. So where does exhalation begin? Does it begin here? Does it begin here? Does it begin here? You could point to any of those spots and it would be exhalation begins there. Because this is all one point in time.
Yeah, I think it's easier to see on the ventilator assisted. It's a straight vertical line. But
All right, so with the pressure time graphic, where does exhalation begin? Does it begin here? Does it begin here? Yes. So maximum pressure builds, and then when the exhalation valve opens, the pressure leaves the lungs and this line comes back down. So inspiration all the way up to the peak, exhalation after the peak.
What's that little end, like right after, is that just not, like, nothing we really pay attention to? Is that
Correct.
like the air conditioning?
Yeah, do you have to pay attention to this? No.
Or, yeah, the little one after that.
Oh, this one?
Yeah. Just looks like.
No, not for now. All right, and then for volume, volume goes into the lungs and then volume comes back out of the lungs. So this is inspiration and this is exhalation. So it says identify the three graphics. And when to identify a graphic, you look on the left to see what the units of measure are, because that's going to tell you what you're looking at. So the first one says the units of measure are in centimeters of water. So what are we measuring?
Pressure.
Pressure. So this type of ventilator breath, there's a lot of pressure that builds up at the very beginning of the breath, and that pressure is held constant throughout inspiration. And then the exhalation valve opens and then the pressure drops down. So inspiration. And then at this point, the exhalation valve opens and this is exhalation. What is the second graph measuring? Flow, very good. So here's baseline. Everything above baseline is considered inspiration. Everything below baseline is exhalation. So we see the flow of air flowing into the lungs. And as the air flows in, we've got some volume being delivered to the lungs. At this point in time, where we see this straight line, this is where inspiration ends and exhalation begins. And now the air comes back out of the lungs, keeps coming out, and then the next breath begins. Okay, and then what's being measured at the bottom? Very good, volume. All right, I was telling you how when the line is going up, that's the volume going into the lungs. When the line comes back down, that's the air coming back out of the lungs. This line should touch the baseline. If all the air that you put in comes back out, that should come down and touch the baseline, but it doesn't. Can you see how it stops right here? Instead of stopping down here. So when it stops, the ventilator will reset the graphic, bring it back to baseline for the next breath to occur. So the air goes in, the air comes back out. Not all of it came back out. Then the ventilator resets the graphic back to baseline for the next breath to occur. Yes. No, it's because there's a leak in the circuit. Maybe there's a leak around the endotube cuff. Yeah, once PEEP goes in and fills up the lungs, that air stays in there. And you don't notice it on your graphics.
So it's not air trapping.
It could be air trapping, yes. Yeah, so it could be volume loss, it could be air trapping, you're correct.
For pressure, is that a patient triggered breath since it has that little bit?
Yes. 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 This one doesn't have a dip and yet it's showing pink, meaning that the patient initiated it. So this one is not very obvious at all. And then when you look on VTI, that's the tidal volume that goes into the lungs. And VTE is the volume that came back out of the lungs. So 275 mLs was put into the lungs, but only 215 mLs came back out. So not only do you have your graphic showing you that you're missing some volume, but you'll also see it on your digital readout.
What kind of parameters do use to decide, when that's too far out of range and you have to start looking at your circuit?
For the adults, 50 mLs. I want to show you a couple more things, and then I have a handout to give you, and then we'll try to identify it from the handout. All right, this is a single breath of air going into the patient's lungs. It's looking at the pressure while the tidal volume is going into the lungs. And it's called a hysteresis curve. And the reason it's called hysteresis is because the pressure that builds when the air goes in is different than the pressure when the air is coming back out again. Because you would think you put the pressure, or you push the volume in, the pressure goes up. The volume comes out, the pressure goes back down. You should think, oh, that's going to be a straight line up and a straight line back down. But it's not. So there's different pressures when the air is coming out compared to the air going in. And that's how it got its name, hysteresis. So on the x-axis is pressure. On the y-axis is volume. So as the air goes in, pressure is building up. There's a certain point here where lots of volume starts to go in. Is this the point where I tell you guys all about that, or do I wait a few minutes? Hold on. I'll wait a few minutes. I just don't like overloading with too much information. I know that's going to make you laugh, but so I'll tell you about this point when we're going through the handout. So the belly of this, I don't know why that looks like a belly, and this looks like the shell of a turtle or something. So as the air is going in, it's the lower line, and the upper line is when the air comes back out. So when you're labeling this, label this as inspiration. Where's my little pencil? So that's inspiration. The pressure builds up as the volume of air goes into the lungs. So how much pressure built up? We would look at this point and try to bring a straight line down and figure out how much pressure built up when this breath went in. What would you estimate? Like,
It says on the side, 23.
yeah, okay, you cheated. 23 centimeters of water. All right, and then this is exhalation. It's hard to draw with a mouse. So that's the air coming back out of the lungs. What is the total amount of volume that went in? So you would look at the top part, come across and look at the volume. Wow, how did you do that? So around 500 mLs of volume was delivered to the lungs. I have to clear. Oh, was that the next one?
There's only 2 slides like that.
Oh, okay. So I'll finish that and then we'll take a break before we. No, I want to, we're going to go for a few more minutes. I want to show you the handout first and then take a break. So graphing flow versus volume. This is another common graphic that you look at on the ventilator. It's called the flow volume loop. And that's the most common way that this is referred to. The flow volume loop. With the flow volume loop, you have the y-axis showing how much flow in liters per second. And the x-axis is showing volume. So the further out this line comes, the more volume that went into the patient's lungs. On top is inspiration, and on the bottom is exhalation. Let me draw that. So here is, oh yeah, me drawing a straight line. So that's the x-axis. Everything above is inspiration. Everything below is exhalation. All right, so during inspiration, the ventilator will deliver some air to the lungs, and as the air is flowing in, you can tell how fast the flow rate is. So whatever the number is right here for flow. So the air flows into the lungs, and then the exhalation valve opens, and now you have a straight line. And now all of this is exhalation and the air coming back out of the lungs. So air going in, exhalation valve opens, and now air comes back out. So inspiration on top, exhalation on the bottom. I have to clear. Okay, identify the 2 graphics. So you're seeing 2 graphics. What is the one on the left? It's red on the top, it's blue on the bottom. What is that looking at? Yeah, that's the flow volume loop. Flow is being measured on the y-axis. Volume is being measured on the x-axis. So flow volume loop is here. And at this point in time is when inspiration started. The air flows into the lungs. At this point, the air stops flowing into the lungs and starts flowing back out of the lungs. So inspiration on top, exhalation is on the bottom. How fast did the air flow into the lungs? I don't know if that's liters per second. It must be liters per minute. So you would look at the highest number and you would see what the flow rate is. The next question I would ask you is how much volume went into the lungs? Yes, 500 mLs. Okay, and now identify the graphic on the right. That's the pressure volume curve or hysteresis curve. Very good. What part is red? Is that the inspiration or the exhalation? Inspiration. And then the blue is exhalation. Very good. How much pressure built up as the air was going in? So you're going to have to make a giant guess here. Well, here's 0 and here's 40. Yeah, maybe like 20 centimeters water. And how much volume gets delivered? 500. So you look at the maximum, the highest it goes, and that's the amount of volume that's delivered. That was it? Okay. All right, so now let's put our newfound knowledge to use. It's me not counting. All right, so you have the paper in front of you and the first page. It wants you to identify inspiration and exhalation on each of the 3 graphics. So with the first graphic, what is that measuring? Flow. And what part is inspiration? Okay, so everything above, oh, cool. Everything above baseline is considered inspiration. So maybe you can draw a line, maybe put an arrow or something. That's inspiration. And everything below baseline is exhalation. Okay, the next graphic, which one is inspiration and which one is exhalation? Oh, the, do I clear it? No.
All 3 of these are from the same breath. But really better, right?
Yeah. Where's the eraser? Okay, I'm not drawing anymore. This is too complicated. So the second one everything,
It would actually help you if you just took a pen and wrote it right on there, because it still shows what you're doing. If you want to do that, but yeah, if you just take a pen and write it right there, it'll still show up on the screen.
okay. Yeah, I have extra copies of this. I have an extra copy. Thank you. All right, so inspiration starts here and goes to here. So that's all inspiration. And then when the line drops back down, that's exhalation. And then at the bottom, as the volume goes in, that's all inspiration. And then when the line goes back down, that's exhalation. Okay, so now what is the peak airway pressure on each breath?
20.
What are the units?
As long as everything's water.
Yes, very good. What is the pressure at the end of exhalation? Very good. Does everybody see how the pressure at the end of exhalation goes down to 0? Okay, and what is the volume of each breath?
That's when it's 200, it's saying it's-
Very good. Okay,
The end of exhalation, does that also peep?
yeah, so the peep here is 0. So identify inspiration and exhalation. On the first one for pressure. Pressure builds up as the air is going into the lungs. So when the pressure starts to go back down, that's when exhalation begins. So all of this is inspiration. And then when the pressure goes back down, that's exhalation. Volume, when the volume goes in, the line goes up. When the volume comes back out of the lungs, the line goes down. And with the flow rate, everything above 0 is the air going into the lungs. Everything below 0 is the air coming back out of the lungs. So,
With this patient, would this be a cause for concern? Is that pressure is rising with each breath, but volume is decreasing with each breath?
yes, that is a concern. All right, so that straight line going down, again, it's all one point in time. That's when the exhalation valve on the ventilator opens up and then the air can leave the lungs. So it switches from the air going in to the air coming back out. Does all the air come back out? Does this hit baseline by the time the next breath begins? And the answer is no. We spend more time looking at that. But there wasn't a chance for all the air to come back out before the next breath started. Right there. All right, it says explain. We'll stop after this one. Explain what causes the first loop to appear like it is lying down. And then what causes the second loop to appear like it is standing up. So to answer that question, you have to realize what you're measuring. So here it's pressure. So you've got a lot of pressure building up as the air goes in, but not much volume is being delivered. Here, you don't have much pressure building up at all, but lots of volume goes into the lungs. So how would you write that to describe it?
Yeah. The first lung is non-compliant.
Low lung compliance, very good.
And that's
Very good. So the one on the bottom, it didn't take much pressure at all to put a lot of volume into that lung. So that's a very compliant lung. And the one on the top took a lot of pressure to get a little bit of volume in. So that's a stiff lung or low compliance. Okay, so we'll stop there, give you guys a 15-minute break. I'm gonna run downstairs, eat some oatmeal, and I'll be right back up. Yeah. Needs to be large enough so it'll come in the arms.
I didn't see her show it. I was like, I don't this is the first time I can see him live. Brent, and you explained that graph to me. This is the first time I can say I'm lost. It's the whole, I can't read the graph. You can help me? Okay.
I think I actually understand this one.
Yeah, this is the first time I can say I'm honestly lost. I don't understand these benefits.
So the bottom is during inspiration, right?
The line, the baseline.
That's the pressure, the baseline. It might be easier to look on your paper so I can point to it.
Are you even, oh, I don't know.
So that's the pressure, right?
Mhm.
So this, as it goes out higher, that's more increased pressure, right?
Mhm.
This is inspiration. So you can see it's taking a lot of pressure in order to inspire, to breathe in. To see, this is the inspiration and the pressure line's all the way up here,
Mhm.
right? So, and then this is the volume. And do you see
It's
even,
being pushed into.
right, so even though this pressure is going really high, the volume is staying low. See how here on this one,
Mhm.
it's all the way up here, it's a lot of volume. On this one, there's no volume, but yet the pressure is all the way out. So when they're breathing in, it's taking so much pressure to get that air in, yet they're still not getting volume in their
I
lungs.
didn't know that they have
So that's saying like the lungs are stiff,
meaning they have like.
low
COPD or something like that.
compliance. Yeah, like they're, I don't know what.
I do.
But,
So yeah, there's not a lot of pressure here, so they're getting the volume.
right, and here, they're hardly having to apply any pressure when they breathe in. They're just breathing in and it's, the volume's shooting way up, so their lungs are very compliant, they're expanding super easy.
This is the first time that I've been lost.
Sometimes it's just like she explains it weird, and it's like simple. But what I have to look back in my notes to see what causes that low.
This is the first time I've ever seen the word, yeah.
Yeah, I have her lab right out. I think there's like an hour break in between, right?
Who's that?
Yeah, that's
The
what I
ones-
thought. It's nice that they're coming. I don't want to like.
Well, there's two different times. Some of us have a really long break. and some of us have an hour break. Mine is, I think it.
Is that on our schedule?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact, but I know like, we all have at least 1 hour break and some of us have lab right away and then others don't have it till 3:30. Mine's right away. So I have like an hour in between.
Oh, you got more?
I love that idea because.
Do you see?
Mine's at 12:30.
I'm literally like circling it right
And
away
mine
so
is
much.
too, yeah.
Yeah,
So then ours is what, 12:30, 2:30, something like
I
that.
like that. All right, I want to do that right now.
Wait, I really, yeah, so we don't have an hour in between, like,
I
this
do
lecture.
I did it too.
Okay,
Nobody,
got it.
nobody told me anything. I didn't even think that.
You
Thanks.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm good at it.
Yeah.
That's what my class was. So I was more focused on my class.
Okay, so here's in my notes, so the COPD is actually when you have low compliance.
And they have like little guidance.
So, like to the gravity of questions about.
Yeah, which part's inspiration?
All the way to the end.
Everything.
Yeah, so this is actually COPD because the people with COPD have high compliance. So it's easy for them to ventilate, to get it in, but they have a hard time getting it. Yeah, easy to ventilate, low elasticity, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I
yeah,
can-
When she said one second, I'm like, that makes
She
complete
said right
sense.
under
So.
the zeros are starting, but
Yeah, but it goes past the baseline.
Right.
this expression starts at the
High
base.
compliance, decreased ability to recoil, low elastic recoil.
Well,
So everything
Because it's all
above it.
stretched out of place.
It's all stretched out. So it's
Nothing in it, so it's
going
because
back.
it's still 1 second at a time, so it's all happening at
It's all
once,
one- yeah.
and they're just
So this is
showing
a-
it.
So
It's
then what
different.
would you use? I don't
Like
know,
me,
an
with stiff
example
lungs.
of, yeah, like who would
This
have,
is the version that
Will you stop that right there? Now you gotta let go of your breath. It's kind of all.
Let me go
happening.
to my notes.
It's all happening at once, and that's the only way that's.
Now this is back to inspiration. That's coming back to inspiration.
No, this is all coming, this is what I understand, yes.
But you gotta understand that the graph is not measuring, the graph is showing it, but it's not showing you. in that
She just explained it and it was
one
perfect.
time, you know, it's like one motion.
Yeah, you just have to think of it in the time frame.
You guys, what are some of the causes of stiff lungs?
I can't explain it, but I
She
know.
said air, yes, she said pulmonary edema.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's everything we went over.
Oh, okay.
It's just this one has.
She said pulmonary fibrosis.
Right here it is. Pulmonary fibrosis, pulmonary edema, ARDS.
All that is
Okay.
pressure right here, 'cause one pressure right
But yeah,
here.
it's the same thing, and then this is
So
the.
this
So
is
is that
the
right?
whole-
That's the.
This is.
The high
elasticity,
compliance,
and this is
COPD and
elasticity.
emphysema, did I have that right?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, buddy.
I'm gonna go to my markers. So
Yeah,
that's
buddy.
genius.
But we're gonna study that.
The one where she was like, oh, she said that. Excellent. Well, something like that. Like study schedule.
I get one.
I'm not actually.
I can only accept to get help from you in class.
I'm not.
Out of class time, you just, you gotta do not disturb.
Everyone's a do not disturb.
I understand our relationship. I understand.
But I check it afterwards. I check it afterwards and I call you back.
It's like a week later.
Bro, it's still a call back.
It's okay.
Oh my god. So don't listen to that. I'm not gonna say something. Just start it up.
No, summer's just as bad as you.
Yeah, I'm
Summer-
probably worse.
Summer is just as bad. Summer get back to you like in a month.
Yeah, I'm worse.
Me.
I have friends I don't talk to, and then I talk to like a year later.
I'm like that. I haven't been in every relationship before I'm like that
It's all
because
good. I know what
I
I'm
feel like
working with.
everyone knows me like stop this.
Yeah,
I
they
just
have to
don't-
accept me as being
Well, you could've texted
shitty at texting people and staying in contact with people.
So do I. It's just like I literally
rather
rather call people.
Same.
I
My
like
friends get so mad at me when I call them, they're like,
Okay, so it doesn't,
harass-
I don't harass you that
I would
Depends
prefer a
on the
phone call than a
person.
text message. I'm just letting you know.
It depends on the
I prefer a phone call. I'd rather have a
Don't text
conversation
me
for
because-
5 minutes instead of fucking texting.
Thank
Get my
you,
point
like,
across.
it's not important
some
if it's
people I
a
don't
text
wanna hear
message.
Well, that makes me feel better, because usually the people I talk to, they're like, just text me, and I'm like,
No,
but I'd
that
rather
means
talk
I-
to you, like.
That's just dragging the conversation. It's not important and I can get back to you whenever I feel like
No,
it.
see, but texting, I can just stop. I'm done. When I'm done. I'm
Right, because we don't care about the conversation.
I'm
If you
done.
text me, don't leave.
So
Just
if
give me
you
a phone
keep
call.
texting me, I may, I gotta come home. You're gonna keep rambling, and I'm gonna be like, yo, bro. I got another call coming. That's what I have.
Oh, God, I don't think I can believe you're something that is.
That's what I do, bro.
To like, people.
No, but that's why I gave you permission. You can call me, buddy. You got the green light to call me anytime.
Yeah. They start.
I don't know, when she showed me that, I was like.
Maybe you tell me like,
Soft, and I was like, she's like, anyway. I just, when she did, I saw, I was like,
So much is it? Yeah.
are you done?
You got a highlighter?
she said it.
Yeah, I'm gonna give you some.
I don't see that right there.
Hey, your pilot.
Yeah.
I'm just using the same color.
I know, I was like,
So,
G.
I literally was just saying this with them, and you guys weren't here.
Okay,
like,
look, I might touch this and it might turn into this. I can have this? This fancy, though. Look at the-
I don't like pictures.
No, like, I like the word, I was literally just telling them,
Yeah.
you look cute. When I bought it, it was scholarship.
Yeah.
I was literally just telling them, I was like, I literally only wear band shirts and anime shirts,
Right,
so I
I
gotta
love
wear
Target.
something that.
I literally found Meeples in Target for $5.
Like,
These are $5.
I still go to
What
school
shoes?
here.
Yes.
Oh, no, I don't know. Target.
What? Crazy.
But I'm not wearing makeup.
Why?
You wear, if you go out somewhere, like when there's dinner,
I just buy
I
stuff.
would give it up, but,
Let me do your.
You'll rarely touch
I
me.
bought a Ninja food.
I don't care how much of a ball I look like. What? You will not touch me in makeup if I'm not going out.
Oh, I was like,
Exactly.
what?
If I'm not going to like a nice dinner, like if we ever all come together and have like a nice dinner,
You could do that.
I'll admit, it's fire, but ain't gonna happen here.
I only put it.
I actually put a real bra on today because.
I brush foundation on my face with my fingers
I know.
every morning. You should. Because my face is so red. But it takes too long. I just want to go like this.
I heard Renfest is the weekend that we're in spring break if I know.
I just, if I don't
We can
get
get
my
drunk
finger,
there, I'm okay with that.
Huh?
Yeah, Renfest is
Again?
over Quiet
Wasn't it
Waters.
the other day?
Renaissance?
It's like every weekend in
that
February
rock?
and March.
What's
Renaissance, it's like tiny, like, Renaissance age.
And then
Renaissance
they get
era
drink
in
times?
history.
I'm gonna drink
Mead.
Yeah.
I have some needs, but yes.
meat is so fucking good. It's like
Actually-
cider, it's
Wait,
amazing.
I've actually never heard this drink.
Wait,
It's so
Taylor,
good.
I showed you the one I
Never
had,
watched
I
Game
wanted
of
you to
Thrones?
try it.
I know. I love it. I was just so
I don't think
hungover
it's
that day. I never told
Oh, yeah,
you.
that's right.
I'm just letting you tell this summer.
Game of Thrones.
What is mead?
Mead
It's
is funny one.
old school beer.
I have some if you wanna try it.
How do you want to drink this?
I bought some, I was offering some to Kim to try because I was like, it's really good. But it's funny crisp apple and it's made in like Kissimmee or something, so.
That
local.
sounds.
No, it's so good. It's really. I have there's a honey mead cherry cider that I'm obsessed with.
Oh, I've tried it.
And it's called Zombie Killer. I don't know if you've ever had
I've
it,
never tried
but
that.
it's freaking amazing. It tastes
So,
like juice.
When I went to the Renaissance Festival in November, because they have one in Hollywood in November at CY Park. And it's really small compared to the one they have at Quiet Waters. Quiet Waters is huge and they've had it forever now. But they had a vendor there selling mead and they had like 5 or 6 different ones you can sample them. And there were literally bees everywhere, like wild bees. And I'm like, did you guys bring a beehive with you or something? They're like, no, these are local bees. They just know there's honey here and they come and collect. Because they sold regular honey, like from like all different seasons, because I have allergies to all the plants around here. So I like to eat local honey. So I bought some. And then like, because there were little samples of like weed everywhere, like the liquor was kind of all over. Maybe there were bits of honey, I don't know. But there were bees everywhere, like everywhere.
Like a 3.
So it was kind of nice. It was great.
Yeah, we get all the shoes.
No, I fucking don't. I didn't want.
What size were kids?
3.
Wait, you only wear kids? You can't wear women's?
I can. A kid's 3 is a woman's 5.
A women's 5 is kids.
So that's why my kid's like 4.
But it's like a woman's 6.
Yeah, I have giant feet.
But both sizes, like there's a lot of, there's not really size 5s and everything.
You know, I
Feel
feel for you because I have.
Yeah.
I have size 10, and that is what I struggle with. So,
Size 10 in women?
yeah.
So you're looking over.
But that's all we-
That's what they call it, but they got professional, man.
Or it's old.
They got-
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think they're gonna sound like that. I'm not interested in professional.
This is like, you know, we don't really know what the status is. And then, you know, for the first
I'm
time
trying to see
forever,
what they're working with.
let's try to-
That would be tough for the losers.
What are you saying the rest of us were playing?
They were extremely.
I grew up.
They were big,
Oh my God. You and him, it's like.
Yeah,
I get-
I feel like that.
Like, yeah.
Yeah, you can't deny you.
No.
I think something they're trying to court me.
They're trying to court you.
They're trying to
It's
convince
okay.
you.
They're my brothers. Like,
Wait,
same
what?
ones.
I know, but, you know, I got.
I can't deny how big they are.
Do you wanna stay here when you do your?
In the job description, you read it, that's what it says. So they're even set up this morning.
That's where you wanna go after.
Because like we all like.
Maybe I know my friends. You don't have a lot of. My friends that are, we don't have enough there.
One is, yeah, that only for originally 31, 15 hours, whatever. Right.
It's kind of like probationary.
it's
We're
not
ready
great,
for
but, that's what-
We usually use
Oh, yeah, that's fine. We're like, nah.
I do it every day. Like, early.
That's what I
It was
want.
so.
Oh, I didn't turn off the recording.
I was like,
All right, we're going to keep going. This is showing you a picture of a hysteresis curve or pressure volume loop. It says, it asks you to explain why the loop starts at 5 centimeters of water. Why do you think that is?
Did they initiate? Is there like another kind of pressure already, like? back there?
Right, very good. So there's a positive pressure in the lungs before the breath even begins. We call that PEEP. Yes. A positive pressure in the lungs at all times, PEEP or PEEP. And then it says, write the peak inspiratory pressure. How would you figure that out?
Would it be like 35?
Yeah, around 35 centimeters of water. So that would be the peak inspiratory pressure for that breath. Label the side for inspiration. Very good. And then label the side for exhalation. Notice the lower inflection point does not exist. Okay, I was supposed to tell you about that when I was showing you the lecture note. I can show it to you here.
Doesn't this go for lights?
You are. It readjusts. Give it a second. So I do need to tell you about the lower inflection point. And looking on the graphic, you see how pressure is building up, but not much volume is going in at that point. And then all of a sudden, the lungs start to fill with air. It's almost like there's a change in direction. So first, there's pressure building up. So I said pressure is building up, but not much volume is going in. And then all of a sudden, lots of volume goes in. So when you see the line going up, that's all the volume going into the lungs. So that point where it changes direction, a lot of pressure, and all of a sudden the volume starts going in, that's called the lower inflection point. So the lower inflection point is the point where the alveoli open up and now the volume can go in. So the lower inflection point is when the alveoli open up and the volume can go in. All right. Oh, I didn't spell it right. So the lower inflection point is when the alveoli open up and now the volume can go in. Yes.
So on the other one where it says notice it doesn't exist, is there a reason why, or is it just because of the typographic?
And the other one, the alveoli are already open, so the air just goes in.
Oh, that's for the peak.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this one, you don't see a lower inflection point because the alveoli are already open. And then on this one, there is a lower inflection point. Right at around 20 centimeters of water. So it takes about 20 centimeters of water to open up the alveoli so that the volume can go in. And then it asks, what would you do to correct the problem? Oh no, it's talking about the duck's beak, sorry. Okay, so there's something else to show you on this hysteresis curve. At the top of the curve, there's like they call this like a duck's beak. Does that look like a duck's beak? If you use your imagination. All right, so what's causing the graphic to look like a duck's beak? And the answer is it's putting too much tidal volume into the lungs and overstretching the lungs. So a duck's beak forms when there's too much tidal volume and it overstretches the lungs. So let me explain why it looks like a duck's beak. So after most of the tidal volume goes in, at this point, the lungs are full. So pushing in more volume is really stretching the lungs and causing a lot of pressure to build up. So a little bit of volume, but a lot of pressure builds up when you put that into the lungs. So a lot of pressure is building, but for that little bit of volume to go in. A lot of pressure builds for the little bit of volume. What did I write? It's supposed to say going into the lung. I think I said to go into the lung. So the lungs are already full with the tidal volume, and now pushing in that last little bit really overstretched the lung. So what could you do to correct the problem? Very good. So to correct the problem, you would lower the tidal volume.
Lower peak inspiratory pressure.
Yeah, so if you were in a pressure control mode, then you would lower the pressure.
And would you also introduce peak? So the lower inflection point.
Yes. But I think it's asking about the duck's beak. And yeah, when we talk about PEEP, we talk about the lower inflection point and how to set PEEP according to the lower inflection point. I don't want to tell you that right now. For flow volume loops, it says, notice that loops usually begin and end at the same point. This will only occur if the volume that was delivered to the lungs is the same volume that was exhaled from the lungs. So the 2 points should meet if all of the volume came back. Identify inspiration. Where is inspiration on this graphic? Right above the baseline or above that 0 line. That's all inspiration. And then below is exhalation. Okay, and then when he wants us to compare these two flow volume loops, can you see just by visualizing how they look different from each other? The top part looks the same, so the inspiration looks the same, but the exhalation looks really different from each other. Why is that happening? So if you look at the first graph, when the air is coming back out of the lungs, it comes back out pretty quick, faster than 50 liters per minute. So the first graphic is showing that the exhalation, the air is coming back out very easily. The second graphic, the air is not coming out very easily. So it starts off with a good flow, but as the smaller conducting airways are emptying, the flow rate is really slow. So it looks like it's kind of hugging that baseline. So the air is coming out very slowly in this graphic. So the first graphic has a good expiratory flow rate. The second graphic is a slow flow rate on exhalation. So I wrote good flow during exhalation. This is reduced flow during exhalation.
What causes the sudden drop in the exhalation?
It won't be sudden, but bronchospasm can do that. So if the patient goes into bronchospasm, that's what their flow volume loop would look like.
Would this also be due to like a low compliance valve?
No. No, low compliant lungs, the lungs empty very easily. They're stiff, they're hard to inflate, but boy, do they empty easily.
It's like a quick, there's a fast exhalation and then just kind of like
Yeah, so initially, there's some good flow. So when the larger airways are emptying, not a problem. But when you have the bronchioles emptying, there's a lot of obstruction. So the air comes out slowly. What's that? Yes. Yeah, so somebody who has airway obstruction, this is what their flow volume loop would look like. Okay, and then that's just for you to practice. And I think that was it. All right. So now we're going to go into PowerPoint number 2. All right, I want to get through volume. respiratory rate and minute volume. We have time, right? All right, so initial settings for mechanical ventilation. And when you're using all the critical care ventilators, they all generate positive pressure when they're pushing air into the lungs. Negative pressure ventilator would be like an iron lung, or there's one that looks like a turtle shell that just goes on the chest. It's called a chest cuirass. We don't talk about that in this course. You have a module on it during their second year, but for this year, we'll concentrate on positive pressure ventilation. Okay, so starting off is talking about tidal volume. When you place a patient on a ventilator, you have to select the amount of volume that you want to go into the lungs. Well, in order to figure out the volume that you put in the lungs, it goes according to a person's height and whether they're male or female. And the thought is, the taller the person is, the larger their lungs. It has nothing to do with body fat. So if you weigh 450 pounds, do you get a different tidal volume than somebody else who weighs 100 pounds but is your same height? And the answer is no. Both of you would receive the same tidal volume. It has nothing to do with adipose tissue. It has everything to do with the height of your thorax or the size of your thorax. So what you have to do is figure out what somebody's ideal body weight is. And there's a formula. So you have to know the person's height in inches, and you plug it into the formula, and then you subtract it from, you subtract 60 from the height. We kind of work this formula backwards. Then you multiply by 6 for men, and you add 106 to that number. For females, the height in inches minus 60, multiply by 5, and then add 105 to it. So that's how you calculate your ideal body weight. And then once you get the answer, it's in pounds. But when we ventilate, we want to know kilograms. Tiffany, you have a question?
Well, if somebody's height, when you said below 5 feet, wouldn't that number be?
Yeah, below 5 feet, this won't work.
Oh.
So people 5 feet and higher.
So like.
It wouldn't work on you?
I'm curious what they do for that.
Yeah, so you would be 105 only.
Okay, so just- if you don't reach it, they just go with 105 and nothing less.
Yeah. Okay, so does everybody know how tall they are? I want you to figure out your ideal body weight. Danielle, how tall are you? 5 feet 2? So how do you convert 5 feet 2 into inches? Very good. So if you're 5 feet tall, 2 inches, to convert 5 feet into inches, you multiply by 12. If she was 6 feet tall, she'd still multiply by 12, and that's going to convert the feet into inches. And then you add the extra inches. That's how tall are you?
6 feet, 6 feet.
6 feet 1 inches? All right, so how would you convert that into inches?
Same way you do on
Okay, I'm being too simple. All right, so now that you have inches, how do you plug it in? Danielle. So Danielle is 62 inches minus 60. So that's 2 times 5 plus 105. 105 plus 5 times the height minus 60, and it comes out to 115. And that's in pounds. And when you get to your ideal body weight, don't think, oh my gosh, I am nowhere close to that. You never want to be your ideal body weight, because that would mean 0 body fat, which is not healthy. So don't think, oh, but that would be what you get for your ideal body weight. And then change it to kilograms. To change it to kilograms, you divide by 2.2. So for Danielle, 115 divided by 2.2, what does that come out to?
So is it bad if you're below that number?
So you have no body weight.
Oh, I definitely have that.
And then you come up below your number.
Yeah.
Interesting. Oh, very good. This being, what did you get for your ideal body weight?
145 pounds, 65 kilograms.
Okay, very good. CJ?
That's the pound part. That's the kilograms. So I got 184 pounds.
Okay, very good. What did you get, Jensen? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Brent, what did you get?
Let's say 2.7.
Okay, very good. Marlon, did you figure it out?
I got 67.3 kilograms.
Very good. Thomas?
75.45 kilograms.
Okay. Allison?
45.5 kilograms.
Aww. Rachel, what did you get?
64.1.
Okay, very good. What did you get, Sam?
52.3 kilograms.
Okay. What did you get?
59.1 kilograms.
Okay, Chris?
82.6 kilograms.
83.6?
Yeah.
Oh, so you're taller than Jensen. Ah, now I have a new person to pick up.
I got 63.6 kilograms.
63.6, okay.
43.2.
Oh, okay. What did you get, Ken?
55.7 kilograms.
Okay,
59.5.
okay. So we range from 43 to 83 kilograms. All right. I thought I could come up with like a general consensus, but we'll leave it at that. Very good. Oh, and then I need to tell you something. You know how my exams are where I'll give you extra information that you don't even need? Okay, so there's going to be a patient and you have to figure out their tidal volume for the ventilator. And they're going to weigh 300 pounds, but they're 5 feet tall. So when you calculate their tidal volume, are you going to calculate according to the 300 pounds?
No.
No, so don't fall for it. You got it? Mary, don't fall for it. You have to figure out ideal body weight. It can't just be the person's weight.
If he's 5 feet tall, wouldn't it just be 106 divided by 2.2?
Yes, very good. All right, so let's figure out how much volume we would use if we're going to put you guys, no, not put you on a ventilator. First, you're breathing spontaneously. What are your tidal volumes? So you've got your ideal body weight in kilograms. Multiply that number by 5 mLs per kilogram. And that's going to be your normal tidal volume. Chris, what did you get?
I got 13,
318?
418.
418?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we multiply our ideal weight in kilograms times 5.
Yes,
7 to get the range.
that'll be your tidal volume.
Wait, so we're
Well, and then
saying-
the 7 would be the maximum tidal volume. So 5 mLs per kilogram is your minimum tidal volume. That's normal for you. 7 mLs per kilogram is the number that's like your maximum normal tidal volume. Thomas? You want to go right in the middle? Okay, you can do that.
Yeah, so do we do 5 or so, like, how do you know which one to do?
I wanted you to see a range. So, like, what did you get for 5 mLs per kilogram times your ideal body?
216 or 216, yeah.
216 mLs? And what would be your maximum? Multiply by 7.
302.4.
Okay, so around 100 mLs difference. All right, so everybody got their tidal volume that's normal for their body size? All right, now we're going to put you on a ventilator, and we use a different range on a ventilator. Typically 6 to 8 mLs per kilogram ideal body weight. 6 to 8 mLs per kilogram ideal body weight when you put a patient on a ventilator.
So account for that dead space.
Yes, very good. Want to make sure we have good alveolar ventilation. Now, putting 6 to 8 mLs per kilogram ideal body weight tidal volume into a patient, if they have stiff lungs, you end up getting really high pressures. So you're not going to use that tidal volume if they have really stiff lungs. You're going to use a smaller tidal volume to try to avoid all the pressure that builds up. And you're going to use a range of 4 to 6 mLs per kilogram. It says if acute lung injury is present. Smaller tidal volumes will prevent high pressures. All right, so if you're putting a patient on a ventilator and they don't have acute lung injury, what range would you use?
6 to 8.
Very good, 6 to 8 mLs per kilogram. So I think that's all I wanted to tell you. Calculate the tidal volume for a female patient, 62 inches tall, who will be ventilated with 8 mLs per kilogram. So I'll give you a minute. Do you need light or can you see in the dark? I want to know what tidal volume you'd like to put this patient on the ventilator. It's a 62-inch female, and you're going to ventilate with 8 mLs per kilogram. What did you have? 418.4 mLs. Okay, tidal volume is in whole numbers, so we don't need a decimal point. Tidal volume, 418 mLs. So first you did ideal body weight, right? Plug 62 inches into the ideal body weight formula. That's what you got also? So once you got the ideal body weight, then you multiply by 8 mLs per kilogram.
Danielle, was the example 14.
So you take the ideal body weight multiplied by 8 mLs per kilogram, because that's what I told you we're going to ventilate with. When you multiply those two, you're gonna come out with mLs. So that's how you figure it out. Okay, of course, we've got to do it reverse, don't we? We start our shift, you get your report from the previous respiratory therapist, and you go to the ventilator and you want to make sure that the tidal volume being delivered to the patient is good. So we've got a patient on the ventilator, they've got a tidal volume of 700 mLs. How do you figure out if it's within 6 to 8 mLs per kilogram?
Would you just divide 700 by 56?
Very good. So if you know the tidal volume, you divide by their ideal body weight, that's going to give you mLs per kilogram. Let me put that in the chat.
Leave that one like a decimal or?
There with, yes. You can, I guess you could. Thanks, Chris. So I just wrote down, if the tidal volume is known, divide by the ideal body weight, and then you'll get the mLs per kilogram. Okay, and then additional practice is available in D2L. So if you're given the tidal volume and asked how many mLs per kilogram, you're not going to give a range at that point. You're just going to take the tidal volume, divide by ideal body weight, and say what the mLs per kilogram is. There's no range there.
So when it's out of those ranges, like for that one, I got 12.5. Would that just be correct? Like, but it's out of that range of 6 to 8.
So 12.5 is too big of a tidal volume. If you're ventilating with 12.5 mLs per kilogram, that's too big of a tidal volume.
Yeah.
So that's when you call the intensivist on call or pulmonology or whoever's overseeing the patient and say, we're ventilating with 12 mLs per kilogram. You're concerned about barotrauma to the alveoli. You'd like to reduce the tidal volume and increase the respiratory rate. Yeah, so that's a conversation you have to have. You don't just say, oh, well, the last shift had it like this, so I'm going to leave it. Never, 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 because of all the damage that you're doing to the lungs by allowing that bigger tidal volume. You always have to have that conversation. And then you're going to get the ego trips that say, that's what I put on there, and that's where it's going to stay. And at that point, you have nothing to do. I don't know who you report somebody like that to. Older physicians are not on board with the damage that big tidal volumes cause to the lungs. So you approach them, you talk to them, and they just stand their ground and say, no, that's what I wrote, so that's what you follow. So you come across that a lot too, unfortunately. But yeah, that's way too much tidal volume for that patient. Okay. Let's see. All right, so when we're putting a volume of air into the patient's lungs, of course, pressure is going to build. What do we call the pressure that builds during inspiration? Oh, oh, my ears. I didn't hear you. What did you say? PIP. Peak pressure. Peak inspiratory pressure. So you can put any of those down. What is the maximum acceptable peak inspiratory pressure?
Depend on the patient.
30 to 40.
Yeah, so having pressure build over 30 centimeters of water is a concern. So write down 30 centimeters of water. So why don't we want pressure to go higher than 30 centimeters of water? And the answer is we want to avoid lung injury from the high pressure. We want to avoid lung injury from the high pressure. Brent?
So the normal is 30 to 40, but you don't want to get.
Yeah. So with, I try to abbreviate things just so I don't have to give you too much information, but when I try to abbreviate, I'm not giving you a whole story. So peak pressures can go high if the patient bites on the endotube and you get high pressure from that. That pressure is not being felt in the alveoli. So it doesn't really harm the alveoli if you get high pressures from them biting on the tube, if they go into bronchospasm, high pressures build. That's not affecting the alveoli. What affects the alveoli is when the plateau pressures are higher than 30 centimeters of water. And not 30 to 40, there's no range. If you do a plateau pressure and it's higher than 30 centimeters of water, something needs to be done at that point. Either a smaller tidal volume, change over to pressure control. You don't continue ventilating with the same tidal volume if your plateau pressures are higher than 30 centimeters of water. You're damaging the alveoli. So plateau pressure. This is not asking you about plateau pressure. This is asking you about peak pressure. So peak pressure is not the best number to go by as far as damage. So the number that I'm giving you is more of a general statement for peak pressure, because it's our plateau pressure that we're more concerned about.
They're both 30.
Yes, for now, yes. What affects the pressure that builds during inspiration? We talked about this last week. When we push the volume of air into the lungs, there's different variables that cause the pressure to build up. Can you think of any of them? Airway resistance and lung compliance. Excellent. So with airway resistance, that covers a list. Secretions, bronchospasm, really fast turbulent flow rate, small endotubes. All those airway resistant things will affect pressure. And then the stiffness of the alveoli will affect the pressure. So those two things. All right, volume in should equal volume out, or it's said it vice versa. So if you put in 400 mLs, you should get 400 mLs back. Name 3 reasons why exhaled volume may differ from inspired tidal volume. So the first one is there's a leak somewhere. So it could be a circuit leak. So instead of the air going to the lungs, it went out the leak in the circuit, and now it doesn't return back to the exhalation valve. So it could be a circuit leak. There could be a leak around the cuff. So that could be another reason. You push the volume of air in and some of it just leaks around the cuff up into the mouth and it doesn't go back to the volume, to the ventilator. Next one is incomplete exhalation. So when a patient breathes in and they're breathing out, maybe they get ready to think they're going to say something and they breathe back in before they've exhaled all their air. Eventually the air comes out with air trapping because you can't put a volume of air in and only exhale some of it. Next breath goes in, you exhale some of it. Next time you inhale, you only exhale some of it. Your lungs can only get so full. And then they'll just stop allowing air to go in. So trapped air eventually comes out, but it may not come out in 1 or 2 breaths. It might come out in the 3rd breath or the 4th breath or the 5th breath. So if there's air trapping, it will come out, but not the next breath. So incomplete exhalation or air trapping is another way to say incomplete exhalation. Yes. So air trapping or incomplete exhalation, same thing. And then the graphic display is showing you how you have a loss of volume, and we talked about that already. So at the end of exhalation, this doesn't touch baseline. And then the ventilator resets it back to baseline and starts the next breath. So it looks like the letter V, doesn't it? So that's the ventilator resetting the graphic down to baseline for the next breath to begin. This is really old, and I found it interesting. Oh, I have the lights on again.
Here for an incredible career in nursing.
Oh,
That's
really?
always-
It's just what we wanted to hear, you know?
Hands-on training. Learn
1969. So the respiratory therapist comes, he checks the chart, he sees that there's an order. He goes into the special care unit and there's a patient on the ventilator. And there's the ventilator. So in order to see exhaled tidal volume, there was this bellows spirometer, and the patient's exhaled air would go into the spirometer and push the spirometer up. And depending on how high it went, you can tell what the tidal volume was. So this is back in the day before there was digital readout. Isn't that interesting? So I just wanted to share that with you. Where did it go? Okay, next we talk about respiratory rate. So a normal respiratory rate on the ventilator is 12 to 20 breaths per minute for adults. (12 to 20 breaths per minute). When you were learning your patient assessment, is that what you were taught is like a normal respiratory rate is 12 to 20? That's good, because when you guys have to memorize all these different numbers, like this class says this is tachypnea, and this class says that's tachypnea, it starts driving you crazy after a while. The respiratory rate multiplied by the tidal volume will provide a minute volume. And patient's minute volume determines what the carbon dioxide level is in their blood. So when you draw an arterial blood gas, after you place the patient on the ventilator, you put in settings, 20 minutes after, maybe 30 minutes after you get them on the ventilator, you're going to draw some arterial blood. Then you're going to analyze the blood and see if you're giving them enough ventilation. So if you have enough minute volume, then the CO2 in the blood will be a normal range. You see the connection between minute volume and the PaCO2 from the blood gas? So what would you do if the PaCO2 from the blood gas is too high? You want it to be 35 to 45, and it's 55.
Increase the rate.
Very good. Increase the rate, and that's going to give a higher minute volume. It's going to blow off the CO2.
You can also increase the FiO2. It's not at 100 already.
Yes, but we're just talking about respiratory rate right now. So minute volume determines the PaCO2 on the blood gas, whether it's the tidal volume or the respiratory rate. So if the PaCO2 is low, let's say it's less than 35 millimeters mercury, what is your recommendation for a ventilator change? What can you do to get the CO2 to 40? Decrease the rate. Very good. So you could decrease the rate, or changing the tidal volume also affects minute volume. So you have to know that first before I say my second sentence. So when you're changing ventilator settings to affect the CO2, it could be the respiratory rate or the tidal volume will affect minute volume and will affect the CO2 on the blood gas. Do you have that written down? Do you understand that connection? So to change the CO2 from the blood gas, it's either changing the rate or changing the tidal volume. So that's sentence number 1.
I don't know which one to pick.
And that's sentence number 2. Okay. So if the patient's tidal volume is where you want it to be, you're ventilating with 6 to 8 mLs per kilogram, usually your tidal volume stays. So number 1, I needed you to know that tidal volume affects minute ventilation. But the second thing I want you to know is usually the tidal volume stays and you adjust the rate, because you're setting your tidal volume according to the patient's body size, their body height. So could you change the tidal volume to affect minute volume? The answer is yes. If you're asked which of the following on the exam, which of the following affects minute ventilation, you would choose 2 things, tidal volume and respiratory rate. So both of them affect the minute ventilation. But there's a but. If the tidal volume is set perfectly, you want to leave it there and change the rate instead.
So you can change the rate more than the tidal volume, but there's less chance of harm by changing the rate than changing the
Less chance of harm. Well, you want to get your tidal volume to be proper. So yes to that. And then keep that and then change your rate to affect the CO2 on the blood gas. Okay, so the answer, if CO2 is low, what is your recommendation for a ventilator change? We need to retain CO2 by decreasing the respiratory rate or decreasing the tidal volume. So that's the main statement. CO2 is affected by minute ventilation, and that includes tidal volume and respiratory rate. All right, now the CO2 is high. Let's say it's greater than 45 millimeters mercury. What is your recommendation for a ventilator change? Do we want to decrease the rate? Very good. So we want to blow off more CO2, and the only way to blow off more CO2 is to have a faster respiratory rate or a bigger tidal volume.
Not a question like this on the test. Would you tell us what your tidal volume is so we can determine whether it would be better to change both measuring versus tidal volume?
Or we not have a
Oops.
question worded like that.
So what was it? What is the tidal volume? What should the tidal volume be? Or
Well, no, I know what the tidal volume should be by the calculation, but let's say you ask us, what would your recommendation be for ventilator change, given the CO2 is high? Would you tell us what the tidal volume is set at, so we know whether we should change that or the respiratory?
yes.
Would you also need to know the patient's height? for your kind of question?
Yes, you would.
That was wondering too.
Yeah.
This is gonna be like a 6-point question.
Right.
What were you saying, Brad?
I said, I can do questions on the test. You're gonna give us the patient and then have us calculate, and then at the end of the question. That's the question. Probably want some of these questions. Like that.
Yeah, so here's the tidal volume that you figured out. Is this good for the patient's size, something like that? Yeah.
Kind of understand the process.
Yeah, you have to calculate it and then apply it. That's correct. All right, let's keep going and make good use of time to. Next thing is flow rate. So flow rate is either measured in liters per minute or liters per second. How fast is a normal flow rate? So when you're sitting at your desk and you're breathing in your tidal volume, how fast do you think the air is flowing into your lungs? Did you go through this when you were talking about venti masks in your equipment lecture? Like what is a normal inspiratory flow rate? No. If you did, you don't remember?
Is it 20? I feel like it's 20.
Yeah, 30 liters a minute is a normal flow when we're breathing in. So anytime you're figuring out if a venti mask has enough flow rate coming in, you want to make sure it's greater than 30 liters a minute. Does that ring a bell? Yeah, so normal spontaneous breathing, 30 liters per minute when you're breathing in. And that comes out to about 500 mLs in 1 second. So when you're placing a patient on the ventilator and you can set the flow rate, because not all modes of ventilation do you set the flow rate, but if you could, the initial setting is a little bit faster than normal. It's 40 liters per minute. So initial setting on the ventilator, when you're placing a patient on the ventilator and you need to set the flow rate, 40 liters per minute. patients, especially young patients, when they're in septic shock, they have a really bad pneumonia, their minute volumes will be so high. They'll be breathing 30 times a minute. Their tidal volumes are huge. So their minute volume, I don't know, it could be 20 liters a minute, 30 liters a minute. I mean, they're breathing really fast. So when a patient is breathing really fast, you need to give them the air faster. You can't set the flow at 40 liters a minute if they're breathing in at 100 liters a minute. And so you'll be taught how to adjust your flow rate when a patient is breathing really fast. So 40 liters a minute is your start. It can go up to 120 liters per minute for the inspiratory flow. 120 liters per minute. So if they're breathing really fast, you're not going to stay at 40, but you're going to start increasing that to meet their needs as they're breathing.
If you set the inspiratory, expiratory times, will the vent automatically set the flow rate?
To set an IE ratio on the ventilator? Yeah, none of the ventilators that we use for critical care do you set an IE ratio. You monitor the IE ratio, but it's not a setting. So what you are setting is your inspiratory time, and we'll learn how to figure that out.
This may be a really stupid question, but I don't understand what you mean when you say that if they're breathing fast, then you would increase the flow rate, because aren't they not breathing? That's why we have them on the ventilator. Aren't we deciding on the breathing?
So we're assisting the breathing. So not always is somebody completely not breathing. Maybe if they're heavily sedated, maybe if they fractured 3, 4, and 5 and they can't breathe on their own, then we would do all the breathing for them. Everybody else falls into the category of they're breathing but not good enough, and we have to help them.
So is that when we're looking at the graphs, sometimes there is a patient triggered breath because they can breathe, just not well enough on their own?
Yes. Yes, very good.
They could be breathing really fast on their own and still not put them on the ventilator.
Yeah.
Never knew that.
Yeah, they wear out after a while. Their muscles become fatigued and they can't keep up with that high demand. So when they get fatigued, then the ventilator is there to back up what they're doing. Yeah, I'm glad you asked.
I was literally wondering that the whole time too. I was like, aren't they on a ventilator because they can't breathe? So I was so confused with it.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, sometimes they don't breathe, but most of the time they're breathing, but just not well enough. It's such a high work of breathing for them. So when you're setting the peak flow rate on the servo ventilators, which is what you're using in the lab for the most part, instead of setting the peak flow rate, you change the inspiratory time, and that changes the peak flow rate. I know that doesn't make a whole lot of sense right now. So you're going to have a lot of practice with it when you're working on the ventilators. For now, I need you to know the last 2 bullets. A slow flow will lengthen inspiration. So if you're pushing the air into the lungs and you're doing it very slowly, 20 liters a minute, 30 liters a minute, it's going to take a long time for that volume to get into the lungs. Then if you change the flow rate to be really fast, the air goes in really quick and then it's already in. So a slow peak flow takes a longer time for the air to go in. A fast peak flow gets the air in quicker. So getting the air in slow, getting the air in quick, I'm referring to inspiratory time. So the 2 settings are connected on the ventilator. Whether you're setting the peak flow rate or you're setting the inspiratory time, the two of them are connected. And that's what I need you to remember for now. Changing the peak flow rate changes the inspiratory time. Maybe I should write that. So changing the peak flow rate changes the inspiratory time. A fast peak flow is going to give you a short inspiration. Oh, it says it already. And then a slow flow rate will lengthen inspiration. The flow rate determines the IE ratio, yes. Is it the other way around? No, you don't set an IE ratio. You only monitor the IE ratio. So how do you know you have the right flow rate or the right inspiratory time set? You'll look at the patient and look at how they're breathing, and you want to match what you're seeing. So if you're seeing them having a short inspiration, you want to set a short inspiration on the ventilator. If they're just breathing normal, there's no reason to push the air in really quick. So then you would have a little bit longer time for inspiration. So looking at the patient helps you to set it. The flow rate determines IE ratios, and we're not going to do that today. We'll start with that next week after you finish your test. We'll work with IE ratios. So if that doesn't make sense for right now, that's okay. We'll start with that next week. Next, it says flow rate too fast causes increased airway turbulence. Flow rate too fast causes increased airway turbulence. And you will know that because your pressures go really high. So airway turbulence means high airway pressures. If you have a flow rate that's too slow, it causes asynchrony with the patient, meaning that the patient's already done breathing in, and yet the ventilator hasn't finished putting the breath of air into their lungs. So they're all set to exhale, and this air is still coming at them. So that's an example of having the flow rate set too slow. So it almost is like a cookbook, where you're going to, the more you do this and the more you work with setting the inspiratory times and the flow rates, the better you get with it. I think that's all I wanted to tell you this week. Yeah, so we'll stop here for test 1A. All right, that gives us a little bit of time before Broward Health arrives. Do you guys have any questions? So Mary, I'm going to stop the recording. Do you have any questions? Okay.